Hi, this is Professor Hankinson, and this is the first lecture of two lectures that we have dedicated to our first chapter in the textbook. And this lecture is going to focus on defining government and politics. Okay, so what are we going to be covering in this lecture? The first thing that we're going to do is that we are going to define the term government, and then we're going to learn about different forms of government. We're going to be asking ourselves, when it comes to different forms of government, who is doing the governing, but we're also going to ask ourselves how much control or power does the government have over the people it's ruling. Then we're going to take a look at the difference between government and another key term we're going to be defining in this lecture, which is politics. So let's go ahead and get started. So your textbook defines government as the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. And during the course of the semester, that's what you're going to be learning about, particularly when we get to the section in the semester that focuses primarily on the institutions that govern us and the procedures that basically govern those institutions. So as we're learning about government in the different types of government that we'll be talking about in this lecture, you'll see that all governments share certain specific functions, okay? Regardless of whether a government is presiding over a large territory or a small territory, whether or not that government is a democracy or some sort of authoritarian form of government, they all have certain functions that they engage in. One of the things that they do is that they make decisions, okay? When government is ruling over its territory, it has to make decisions about the people within that territory. One decision that it makes is the kinds of behaviors that people can and cannot engage in. Criminal law is all about prohibiting certain sorts of behaviors and saying that there's a consequence if you engage in a particular behavior. That's a decision that governments make. Another decision that government makes is, how to divvy up scarce resources, right? Land can be scarce, water can be scarce, that they make decisions about who can use it. Land, placing limits on the expenditure of certain resources like water, like if you live in the West Coast, etc. And so governments make decisions, and that's oftentimes known as the legislative function, okay? And so when you see that word legislative, it means the function of making decisions, and the institution that embodies that function is known as the legislature, okay? So keep that in mind as we're moving forward throughout the semester. Another thing that governments do, the institutions that rule over us, is that they take those decisions and they put those decisions into action, okay? And so sticking with the example of prohibiting certain behaviors, okay? A legislative branch can make a decision about that these kinds of behaviors are prohibited, that you cannot kill people, obviously. And so the decision is made that you can't engage in that behavior. Well, putting that decision in action is, well, how do we enforce that law, right? And so you have law enforcement, you have, a certain procedure for dealing with people who engage in criminal laws, and a punishment to set out, right? And so those are all examples of putting decisions into action. That's just one example, but all decisions are at some level put into action. And the institution that deals with that is the executive branch, okay? The executive branch takes decisions and puts them into action, makes them a reality. And then the last thing this isn't an exhaustive list, but another function of government is settling disputes. And so when decisions are made and when decisions are put into action, people might say, look, that the government didn't have the authority to make that decision, okay? Or thinking about mask mandates in Wisconsin, we look at the governor's decision to have a mask mandate or to have a stay-at-home order. And then the state legislature said the governor doesn't have that authority. And oftentimes that dispute is settled in the institution that's known as the judicial branch, okay? Disputes can rise over the authority of a law, whether or not a legislature has that authority. It could be a dispute over the way that that law has been implemented. Okay. And so anytime there's a dispute about the decision or the implementation of that decision, those disputes are settled in the judicial branch. Okay. And so when we're talking about government and the institutions, right here you're getting a sense of the functions and how oftentimes those functions are embodied within particular institutions. Now, something I want you to keep in mind is that there's lots of different types of governments. Those functions are organized in many different ways. In the United States, those functions are separated out. In other countries, those functions can be consolidated into one individual, like a king. And so just keep that in mind, that these are the basic functions of government, but that we see that they're organized, their procedures are different, and the kind of territory they rule over is profoundly different as well. And here are some pictures of institutions of government. Here is the floor of the United States House of Representatives, one of our two branches within the federal legislature, so governing over a big territory. Here is another example of a decision-making branch, a legislature. That's a picture of the Waukesha Common Council, and so they make decisions for the city of Waukesha. Up here is, again, another form of government. This is an example of the tribal council for the Karuk tribe. That is a tribe that's in California. So again, another example of an institution of government that rules over its people and its territory. And finally, this is the Council of Ministers that assist the King of Saudi Arabia. Again, an example of an institution of government. Okay, so we've defined what we mean by the word government. Let's now move to take a look at different forms of government. And the first thing that we're going to take a look at in terms of forms of government is asking the question, who rules? Who's doing the governing? Because who is doing the governing gives us an insight into the type or form of government that it is. Now, a couple things I want you to keep a mind of is that when we're learning about different forms of government, you're going to see this word, this suffix, okay, which is crassy, okay? And so there is an example of where it says democracy, right? Now, when we're learning about different forms of government, that you're oftentimes going to see that crassy suffix within the word. And so when you see that green part, that gives you an indication that this is about ruling. Because crassy is derived from the Greek word kratos, which means to rule or to who has the power, right? And so when we take a look at these types of governments, you're going to see that suffix appearing, and then the prefix will give you an idea of what kind of government, who's doing the ruling. And so the first one we're going to take a look at is autocracy. That's how you pronounce that. Autocracy, okay? And when we know it's about government because it has the suffix crassy, but ask yourself, what is, when you think about the prefix auto, what does that mean? Well, auto oftentimes refers to alone, okay? And so when we think about autocracy, it's a type of government where one person rules alone, okay? And so a good example of a person who rules over an entire territory alone would be a monarch, okay? A king or a queen who basically can make all the decisions, put those decisions into action, and settle disputes when they arise. They alone rule. That there are other types of autocracy as well. A dictator, right? Somebody who doesn't come into power because of their heredity line, but they take power by force. That's also an example of autocracy. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the King of Saudi Arabia is a good contemporary example of one person who rules over a territory. Another type of government is oligarchy. And the oligarchy is the type of government where not just one person rules, but it's the rule of a few people, a small group of people, okay? And oftentimes a subcategory within oligarchy is what's known as a plutocracy. Plutocracy means rule of the wealthy, okay, when the wealthy are doing the ruling. There's a contemporary example of an oligarchy, and that would be Russia. After the Soviet Union collapses and the fall of communism, that in the aftermath of the fall of communism, there were a small group of people within Russia who became very wealthy. And oftentimes people look at Russia and see those wealthy Russian oligarchs as really having the power, behind, Putin or the president, having the power to basically rule over that territory. So kind of a contemporary example of oligarchy. Theocracy, okay? Crassy, we know it's a government. Theo, what kind of ruling is that? Well, my dog's name is Theo, so maybe it's rule of the poodles, the crazy poodles. I'm not sure I'd want to live in that type of government. But what else? Theology. So theology, religion. Theocracy is rule of the clerics, rule of religious leaders. And so maybe you can think of some examples of where we have religious leaders who are doing the ruling. A good example of that is Iran. Iran is a good example of where they do have a civilian president, but there is a religious, the Ayatollah is the religious head of that government in Iran, and that any decisions that the legislature makes have to be approved by the religious clerics. A contemporary example right now is Afghanistan. Okay, when the Taliban took over with the withdrawal of the U.S. troops, the Taliban has established a theocracy within Afghanistan, which many people are concerned about. The United States is an example of a democracy, and that is a rule of the people. And so demos is Greek for the masses. Okay, democracy was not always seen as a stable form of government. You're going to see that our framers were really worried about instituting a democracy because it's seen as letting the people rule is seen as an unstable form of government. But today we talk about democracy as rule of the people. Okay, and in our next lecture we'll get into more detail about what that actually means. So all of these are who is doing the governing and different forms of government. Okay, so one way of thinking about government is asking yourself who's doing the ruling. Another way of thinking about government is asking how much power does the government have over the people that it is ruling over? In other words, are there any limits that are placed on the power of government? And so we're going to be taking a look at three major forms of government as it relates to how much power governments have. We're going to take a look at totalitarian governments, we're going to look at authoritarian governments, and then we're going to look at constitutional governments. And so let's look at these in more detail on the next slide. Okay, so the type of or form of government that has almost total control over the people that live in its territory is what is known as totalitarian government, thus its title, total control, totalitarian government. Basically, totalitarian governments recognize little to no limits on their authority. In other words, those types of government can do whatever they want. And even if there is a constitution and even if there are laws, the totalitarian government doesn't abide by those laws. They are above the rule of law. And so totalitarian government recognizes little to no limits on its power. But it even goes farther than that not only does it exercise its power sort of from a governmental perspective, it also tries to have complete domination over all aspects of people's lives. And so when you think about good historic examples of totalitarian government, one would be China under the rule of Mao Zedong from 1949 to 1975, or Germany under the Third Reich under Hitler. Those are good examples of totalitarian governments. And in both of those types of government, the government had complete control over people's lives. It controlled how they dressed, how many children they could have, the kinds of art they could engage in, right? Or the kinds of art or readings or writings that were prohibited. Stalin during the Soviet Union, also totalitarian. And so it's not just that the government is exercising its authority in normal governmental ways, but it's actually just trying to dictate every single aspect of people's lives. Total control. Authoritarian government is similar to totalitarian government in that it technically has no limits on its power. However, that it focuses its control not on complete domination of everybody who lives in a society, but it focuses its control on certain key aspects of society. In other words, if you are not seen as a threat to the government in an authoritarian government, you'll kind of be left alone, right? That the government may not interfere with your life in a completely dominating way. However, if you're seen as a threat to that government, then the government will dominate you. 21st century China is a really good in the Chinese Communist Party is a really good example of authoritarian government. In certain ways, they allow there to be some freedom where people can make decisions, particularly in the economic realm. But when it comes to other groups, particularly groups that are seen as threatening to the Chinese government, they'll crack down on them with total control. A really good example of that is the democratic uprisings that took place in Tiananmen Square in the 1980s in China. The calls for democracy, people called for democracy, total clampdown on them. So good example of an authoritarian government. A constitutional government there are clear limitations on the power of government within a constitutional system. That the power of government is formally limited by a constitution, and that there are consequences for when the government does not abide by the Constitution. So let's dig into the type of government that the United States has, which is a democracy, and it's also a constitutional government. Okay, so what form of government does the United States have? The United States form of government is known as a constitutional democracy. That as a democracy, it's rule of the people. But what does that actually mean? When we talk about rule of the people in the United States, that it is seated in the concept of popular sovereignty. And what that means is that when you look at the political authority with who has the political authority in the United States, that political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. Sovereignty, authority, popular people. And so in a democracy, a contemporary democracy, it basically means that the people have to approve of the decisions that our government is making, right? Now, on our next lecture, we're going to talk about, to what degree, like, we actually realize democracy in the United States, right? A lot of people don't vote. Oftentimes what the people want is not reflected in the decisions that government make. But at least from a theoretical perspective and a key value of living in democracy, the idea is that the people are the ones who have the ultimate political authority. Now, in the United States, there's lots of different ways in which people can rule. The United States has a very specific type of democracy. As it says there, that the United States is known as a republic or a representative democracy. But just because the United States is a republic doesn't mean that it's not a democracy. It is a democracy. It's just a certain type of democracy. And what representative democracy or republics are, it's where citizens have a regular opportunity to elect governmental officials, and then they are our representatives, and they represent the will of the people, at least in theory, right? And that we have regular opportunities to elect them, and also we have regular opportunities to say, we don't want you anymore, we're going to replace you with some other representative. And so our kind of democracy is somewhat indirect. The United States is not, at least not at the federal level, is not a direct democracy. And what a direct democracy is where citizens vote directly on laws and policies. At the federal level, we never have like federal referendums, right? The question is never put to the people like, oh, do you want to increase Medicare from just being for the elderly or or do we want to increase it so that it's eligible for everyone, Medicare for all? That question is never put directly to the people of the United States at the national level. We don't have national direct democracy. Now, as we move on this semester, you'll see that there are times when states have the opportunity to put a question directly to the voters. Doesn't happen a lot in the state of Wisconsin, but in other states like California and Washington, Oregon, those western states, Colorado, that's how they legalized marijuana, right? They had direct democracy. They put the question to the people, and the people were like, "Giddy up!" Recreational marijuana for all, right? That's just one example. They vote on whether they want income tax, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but at the federal level, the United States is a representative democracy. It is not a direct democracy. Okay, so the United States is a democracy, but the United States is also a constitutional government. And so, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that there are clear limits that are placed on the powers of government, and there are also clear prohibitions that are placed on government in terms of interfering with people's personal freedoms and liberties. And so, in a constitutional government in the United States, all of the government in the United States at the federal level, and then states have constitutions as well, and so state governments are limited by their constitutions, that all government in the United States is limited by the United States Constitution, and it's limited by federal and state law. And so that, as we're going to be learning in the course of the semester in a couple of weeks, the Constitution tells us what are the specific powers of Congress, what are the specific powers of the presidency, what are the specific powers of the Supreme Court, and the Congress can't engage in actions that are not specifically related to their enumerated powers. If they do that, they violate the Constitution, they can be sued, and then the Supreme Court can basically nullify that law, saying, hey, that's not in your powers, Congress, or it can, say to an executive branch, you can't keep engaging in that action if the action is deemed beyond the powers. So all government is limited by the powers that are outlined in the Constitution, also outlined in federal and state law as well. So state law will govern the limitations that are placed on state governments as well. There's also, as I mentioned, a consequence for violating the rule of law. Now, the members of Congress aren't going to be put in jail if they write a bill and enact a bill that is beyond their enumerated powers in the Constitution. But there is a consequence, and the consequence is if the Congress has exceeded its authority, that question that comes to the courts, the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court will decide whether or not the Congress has exceeded its authority, and they can nullify law that is not within the power of Congress. Okay, so there is a consequence for violating the rule of law, as there should be in a constitutional government. If there's no consequence, then the Constitution isn't really worth the paper that it's even written upon. Another important aspect of constitutional government is that people have protections from governmental abuse of power. Okay. And that, and when we get to talking about civil liberties and civil rights in the United States, that's where these protections come from. Civil liberties are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, and civil rights are derived from the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. And it's basically telling government what they can't do. So it's the Bill of Rights says government can't infringe our speech, they can't infringe freedom of press, they can't search us without probable cause. And civil rights is basically saying that government has an obligation to treat people equally, and if they don't, there's going to be a consequence for that. And so both of these are key aspects of constitutional government. Always keep in mind, is the United States actually living up to the promise of being a democracy, popular authority, and being a constitutional government? So we've spent most of this lecture talking about government, but what's the difference between government and politics? Because this class is about American government, but it's also about American politics as well. Well, so as we know, government is institutions and procedures that rule over others. Politics is the conflict over the leadership, structure, and policies of government, okay? So in a way, government, the institutions are there, but then who's going to lead us in our government? How is our government going to be structured? What are the policies that our government is going to implement? Well, it's the conflict and the struggle over who's going to lead us, how our government is going to be structured, and what are the policies that our government implements. That's the product of politics. And so, politics is about struggling to get power so that you can influence who leads us and influences the type of policies that are going to be implemented, right? And so, probably, when we think about political participation, we're going to be learning about that this semester. When people politically participate, that's the main way that people exercise influence in our democracy. It's the main way that they get involved in politics. So, probably the primary way that people try to influence who leads us and what our policies are is by electing a person whose beliefs align with your beliefs and and their values align with your values, right? And so that if you're an individual who would like to see taxes raised on the wealthy, so that money could be used in order to provide, for better infrastructure or other programs and things like that, then you're going to vote for somebody who's going to implement that, and you're going to try to convince others people to vote for that person as well, and hope that you have the power through your votes and the collective power of other voters to elect that person and implement that policy. If you're a person who has different values, basically sees that taxation is a drag on our economy, and you want somebody who taxes people less, then you're going to vote for that person and try to convince others to do the same. And so politics is really that struggle for power and trying to get power in order to elect people or influence and shape government and policies in a way that kind of match up and correspond with your beliefs and values. And here is just some images of people engaging in politics. On the upper left-hand corner there is people who are protesting against vaccine mandates, very hot topic these days. Trying to convince people that vaccine mandates are bad, that it's a violation of liberty, etc. Right below that is a protest that just took place the last couple of days. As many of you have might been following the news, Texas passed a law that prohibits abortion after the first 6 weeks of a pregnancy, and the Supreme Court let that law go into effect, even though many think that that law is unconstitutional. And there's been huge protests in the state of Texas, as is demonstrated by that picture. On the top there, that's a picture of people queuing up to vote in the 2020 primary in Milwaukee. And so it was during we're still in the coronavirus pandemic, but it was during that time there were some changes regarding absentee balloting. So a lot of people had to line up and vote, and huge long lines and queues, and then just some campaign posters from the 2020 election, all of which are examples of people trying to struggle for power in order to influence our governmental leaders and policies. Okay, that's it for this lecture. On the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the key components necessary for a democracy and what is needed for keeping a democracy healthy. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.